Okay, hello and welcome to Annotating Text for Close Reading. My name is Dr. Laura McCusker, and today we are going to be able to discuss and expand upon what does it look like to annotate text for close reading. So the materials for today should be linked into your session matrix, so you can go to the dashboard to see this along with some other pieces. Just the same announcements you'll see at every one of your sessions, that the Act 48 credit will be awarded upon completion of the evaluation at the end of the day, and it's due by the end of the week. Some of our norms is I'd love to see some engagement, so if that allows you to turn on your video, that would be wonderful. If not, we understand. We're going to honor all perspectives and assume really great intentions, because we wouldn't be here, especially on our summers, if we weren't here for increasing student achievement. My name is Dr. Laura McCusker. I am the Assistant Director of Educational Services at Lincoln Intermediate Unit 12. And so what we do in our division, it's not direct student services, but it's direct adult services. We tend to work with your educators and your administrators doing professional development, training, and consultation in many, many areas, but specifically around curriculum instruction and assessment. So that's my contact information. Feel free to use it. Before my life at the IU, I was in the classroom for 10 years in Southern York County School District. I am a certified reading specialist and got my doctorate in professional learning. So it was only a matter of time until I found the IU as a way to reach students through the adults that work with them daily. I tend to do a lot of professional learning in literacy. Specifically, one of my passions is text-dependent analysis. So if you are on Twitter and you look at hashtag TDAIU12, you'll find me there. As well as there is a hashtag for today. So if you are on social media, make sure to use that hashtag that's typed into the matrix. Our objectives for our session is to examine what's significant about annotation. Why are we doing it? And then we also want to determine what should be annotated, understand how to annotate, look at some digital tools, and then discuss how we're using those. So I did have our first check-in question. What's one question about annotation that you hope to have answered? Hopefully you came here because you have a thought on or an interest in annotation. So if you want to answer in the chat, you are welcome to, or you can feel free to unmute and tell me what's something you hope to have answered by the end here. Okay, fresh ideas on how to use it in secondary classrooms. What else? All right, well, hopefully I can meet your needs for that during our session today. So why are we talking about annotation now? There's so many things to be focused on. And so I wanted to bring up that right now, as far as reopening, there are some pieces that are being worked out for curriculum and instruction on what we are supposed to prioritize. And though that hasn't happened from the PDE level, what we're seeing is some of our partners that are in the field are also coming out with publications. So at the bottom of slide 7, you'll see a link out to the priority instructional content in ELA and math for 2020-21 by student achievement partners, or you may know them, Achieve the Core. And so I kind of took this graphic from that as I was unpacking this. We really need to focus at the text at the center of our lessons, especially for this year. And so what that means is around it, we're talking about the content area instruction and close reading of that complex text, all ensconced in this social emotional academic development for this year. And so we're talking about that. And so the major work of ELA and literacy instruction for right now, things like learning to read, which is more of a primary piece, but close reading of complex text and the volume of reading to build knowledge. So all of that comes with annotation. We also heard in the keynote from Dr. Amanda Vanderheyden about these tiers, right, of MTSS support for academics. And I really love that she highlighted this tier 1.5, where we're doing class-wide intervention, because this is where I find so many of our ELA discussions kind of full, where we're trying to figure out, how do I teach tier 1, but sometimes the needs of the tier 1 are a little bit beyond what I'm just giving them in the core instruction. Here's where maybe I need to really monitor how that's going with students. Another piece for annotation is defining it. So all of us on this call, we're kind of looking at annotation as a writing to learn strategy that you put into place during the reading process. And I was lucky enough to be able to attend the Evidence-Based Strategies for Literacy session last by Des Arnold. And she was really clear to give that annotation has an evidence base of a tier 1 strategy under the umbrella of metacognitive strategies, right? So metacognition is where students are understanding the ways that they learn, and that it's a process to learn things as well. So it's really thinking about your thinking, and that's what annotation is. It's reading with a pencil, as Shanahan puts it. So why should we annotate at all, right? It increases active engagement with the text, and it teaches reading as that process, that metacognitive process, to make thinking visible. It also functionally acts as a bookmark for future reference, because as we know, students, and even me myself as a reader, I have a difficult time remembering why I might have highlighted something or which parts of a book or a piece are important to me unless I make physical marks there. And so as we move forward, we're going to look at what should be annotated. You'll notice a piece at the bottom that's the text-dependent analysis resource, Purposeful Annotations for TDA. If you're in the 3 to 8 grade band, then you're pretty familiar with text-dependent analysis because it's a writing task on the PSSA. Even if you're not in the 3rd through 8th grade band, our standards call for analysis, which is really deep level thinking about any of the content we're to teach when it comes to a text. So I'll keep referring to that. That white paper is also in the folder that we have for this session on annotating. So you can find that there. But the two pieces that really we need to think about what should be annotated is that annotations should be purposeful and annotations should be authentic. One of my roles is as an instructional coach. And sometimes when I go into classrooms, and I've been guilty of this myself, we see one or the other at play. So for example, in the classroom, I was working with 7th graders as a teacher, and my annotations, I gave them a very clear purpose by giving them a set of symbols to use. However, then I asked students to use so many of those symbols in their reading. So what happened is that students were using a purpose for annotation, but anything that I got back was not authentic. Just because I asked them to make 5 marks as they were reading didn't necessarily mean that that's how many marks they needed to use for the purpose I had given them in reading. So we really want to challenge ourselves to do both of these things. And so I have a brief video here that helps show how we can take it just apart from maybe just giving symbols and making sure that it's also authentic for our students. This is from the teaching channel, and it's just about 2 minutes long. So as we're watching, again, I want to give you a purpose. And so as you're watching, I want you to think about how this teacher is making it more authentic for his students.
A strategy that I find really helpful when dealing with close reading tasks is called metacognitive markers, or as a more kid-friendly term, thinking notes. So your homework was to read through and use the thinking notes. So we didn't just want highlighted text, we wanted some of those particular thinking notes for your reactions to it. So let's start with the last one there, just something that was confusing. Did anybody put down a double question mark?
The 3rd page in the 3rd paragraph. Z-E-I-T.
Zeitgeist,
Yes.
right? Anybody here familiar with the term zeitgeist? What you might see in a typical text that doesn't use this is highlighting. And students might underline or they might highlight. And really, if they're not tracking their own response to the text, what they're doing is just sort of saying over and over again, this is important. So what we try to do is say, why did you pick those particular elements and what was your reaction to them?
I thought that was a good way to end his entire letter, and it was very well put and ended well.
For a student, it makes a great, helpful way of remembering over a period of time how they reacted to a text.
I was wondering when it says outsiders coming in, what was that referring to? Because it was around quotation marks, so I thought it was referring to something.
The way he put it was really interesting. He was talking about like laws that you break because of like they're not moral laws.
With this, instead of just saying, I highlighted it, I'm not sure why, I can quickly say, okay, who's got something that they thought raised an interesting question? And we can move to some really specific conversation prompts.
So as you were watching that, how did this educator make these thinking marks? How did they help the students have a more authentic response? Any thoughts?
Hi, this is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Well, he kind of turned it around. Why do you have a question? Why is that important to you? Or what don't you understand? So he turned it into more of a why.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody had different thoughts, different understandings. Some were confused about different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Two things that I saw was when he had them choose something that was confusing and the student replied with an unfamiliar vocabulary word, I thought that was good because it might be confusing to others as well. And also by having them do the other things that they found interesting, I think that helped clarify, and it also gave the students talking points to use during class discussions.
I love that. And we have one more response in the chat. It takes highlighting to the level of elaboration now, right? So, and how many of you have seen papers like the one he held up, right? And it was just highlighting, highlighting, highlighting. And when you're looking at the page or you're referring back to it, to Tracy's point, right? There wasn't as much that they could then lean into to have a classroom discussion. There wasn't necessarily that evidence that this extra layer of metacognition by annotating it really allowed students to think about why that was important to them, for sure. So in order to do this, we need to come up with annotation marks for our students, or at least a process. It's not true that you have to use marks, but there are lots of different ways that you can go about this, right? Reading with a pen, which we sometimes say for annotation, doesn't necessarily always mean that that's your tool. So on the right-hand side, you'll see here's just an example of different grade bands and how they might choose to annotate for some pieces. The important piece is less about what your marks are, but that there is an established set of common language for the students in your classroom about how they annotate, so that if they see one another's marks, they can understand how to follow the thinking that ensued. A second way to think about it is if we're not going to use marks per se, then we want to incorporate the use of marginal notes. Again, to make it authentic, to make it meaningful, and to provide evidence that then can be used later in the classroom. So let's take a closer look at annotation marks. Sometimes it looks like highlighting, which I have here on the right-hand side. And by the way, I'm in Zoom. I can be using my annotation toolbar at any time that I'd like. So if I wanted to have a text tool or a draw tool, I could kind of add in different pieces here. So anytime we're using annotation, it doesn't just have to be on a book specifically. Sometimes if we see highlighting like that, it gets to be a bit much. Those colors need to be meaningful if I'm in fact using the tool of highlighters. Underneath on the green part, we see that this student instead has circled, boxed, and underlined different pieces. And so that student, again, has some sort of code for these marks that means something, so that when this student refers back at a later date or has discussion or goes on to do writing, then he or she can come back and understand, what was I really trying to say here? What was the thinking that was going on as part of my learning process? Let me clear all of those and we'll keep on moving. The second piece of annotations are marginal notes. And so here we see an example of, again, a way that a student was able to make marginal notes to show what he or she was thinking as they read. And so you can see even the images on the side. In this picture below, we have sticky notes. And so we have different colors that may be meaningful, but also on that sticky note, the student was able to write a small message to themselves. So again, taking that one layer of, I'm gonna highlight or mark this, but then adding that second layer of, why did I mark this, helps. Someone said into the chat to me that she uses old-fashioned outlining, right? But all of these things help do that in your mind, so you can kind of put pieces together. On the left-hand side here, I have 2 column notes. Some of you might know this as the Cornell note-taking strategy or something else, but on the left column, we have the actual evidence from the text, and on the right column, we have what I think about it. And so again, we have what the author said and then what I'm thinking. So we have that mark in the text of when it is, and then here's why it's meaningful to me. Notice that neither of these ways require the student to actually write on the text, because as we know, sometimes we're using texts that are shared, probably not this year, but we have some textbooks, for example, something that's not able to be written on by our students. So here are some common ways to work around it: sticky notes, a sideline note-taking, etc., etc. This list at the top are ways that basically all of our annotations fall into these pieces. Either a comment on language, questions we have, predictions, opinions, noticing the author's craft or the author's message, making connections, reflecting, and then picking up on and making your own arguments. Questions or comments on the different ways we can annotate? Oops. If you do click on that first, it will take you to a protocol for the Cornell note-taking system. I tend to like all of my slides to be interactive when I can. A graphic that I use lots of times when talking about close reading, which is the kind of second part of our discussion today, is this. It helps me compartmentalize what close reading looks like when I can figure out what's the role of the teacher and what's the role of the student. This is taken from Supporting Students in Close Reading by Crest. It is a large document, but the source at the bottom I would highly recommend checking out if you're looking for additional help in close reading. But on the left-hand side, you'll see that the teacher's roles when we're doing close reading include selecting challenging and appropriate text, analyzing the text content and language ahead of time to anticipate potential challenges. Especially for those of us that work with diverse students, we really need to think about our English language learners as well as our special education students, and thinking about how they might need additional support if we're again putting text at the center of our lesson, like that was the recommendation that I started our presentation with today. So where does annotation fall? For teachers, it falls in that spot, right where we're starting to select text, analyze, and anticipate the challenges. We will need to annotate the text for the students so that they can then utilize that information when they're annotating themselves. If I move over to the student roles, then where they're going to annotate in the close reading process is when they are analyzing the text for purpose or levels of meaning. So as they are doing that, they're probably most likely reading the text more than once, as well as persevering in reading and comprehending these challenging texts. So you'll notice that annotation, or this metacognition piece, occurs pretty early in the close reading process when I'm setting it up. Questions or comments on that? All right, let's keep going. Often when I work with teachers on close reading planning, I set up this kind of infographic for them to think about what's my professional responsibility when I'm setting up or designing in that domain 1, preparation and planning. And so, like I mentioned, or you saw on those charts just a slide ago, selecting the complex text, creating the tasks that students are going to do that are aligned to our standards and grade level. I'm going to answer that task to create an exemplar for my students and then plan text-dependent questions. So this is specific to when I'm having students read with the intent that they're then going to respond in some way. So I mentioned the implications for teachers. Well, Laura, what tools are out there to assist, right? An implication for our own planning is that we need to determine the focus for our annotations first. So as the teacher, we need to read and annotate the text, which is sometimes you'll see it referred to as priming the text. So from that large document of supporting students in close reading, there are 2 tools that are available. And you can click through them here on the links on our slide 18, or they're available for you in the folder as well. One is the text annotation protocol, which will help you think through the different levels of meaning of a text as an educator before you work on it with students. And then the next is a text cover sheet. So this might be more how you're intending to use the text with standards that are addressed, the reading purposes, the text complexity, and the challenges that it's going to put together. Planning takes a lot of work. And so I often really encourage teams to work through this together. So if you have a grade level team, getting together and looking at text closely and doing some of these pieces really help to make sure that we have the time that we need in order to do this detailed dive into a text before we use it with students. So let's look at what this might look like. The text annotation protocol is here. I did kind of put it onto screenshots because in that large document, it's broken up over a couple of pages, but it gives you something to think about as you are reading a text ahead of your students. And it gives you some guidelines on what to think about, moving from the big picture to major themes or ideas of any work, types of language, and then really personalizing it for your students and the class that's in front of you. Let's see what that might look like. So on our next slide, we have an example of 11. This text is about for 11-year-olds. But when we're thinking about how this looks by using the protocol, you can notice that there are different colors here for the different types of reading that this teacher did. So this teacher started to notice different pieces, things like the theme of the story that's being led up to, use of a narrator, different sentences. And so though this is an extreme example of the level of kind of an autopsy we would do for a text, it really helps to be familiar intimately with a text ahead of time before you're going to use it with your students. Here's another example that's more of a primary level on where do polar bears live. And so for this, you can see that Sarah Thompson's work, again, though it's much less robust in length and complexity, the teacher still is looking at it very closely to see what are the pieces that we're then going to talk about in class that's going to match my learning objective, that's going to match the standard that I'm trying to use. Questions or comments about the text annotation protocol and what it could create for you? All right. Back in the other resource, thinking in mind having annotation that leads to analysis at some point, there are two different protocols to move through. So one is questioning the author. And so here's where it could be carried out with the teacher priming the text ahead of time, like we just showed, and then introducing a strategy of questioning the author. That would then be modeled with an interactive read aloud, and then we have students generate questions for the author. What is the author trying to tell us? What does the author tell us now? Why do you think the author chose this, right? This is a great strategy to use with students because it really empowers them to start to use some of the language that you use as an educator. A question came in that said, would teachers' primed annotations be shared with students or not? That's a great question. What you want your priming of the text to do is really guide the discussion you're having with students. So to some extent, you're going to create some level of that annotation with your students through the class discussion. If you're having students annotate on their own, you could show them yours as well. It's a great way to model, but I wouldn't overwhelm them with all of it. I would have them look at just one reading. So if you might model for them on my first read, I'm going to be looking for the central idea or the gist of this passage. And so I'm going to annotate everything that helps me think that this might be the main idea. And I'm going to write in the margin how I think that links to the main idea. And so by doing that for students, you're really modeling for them what they need to do. And then at the end, you could compare and you could say, how close was this to what I came up with? Not as a right or a wrong, but as a point of discussion. Good question. How to annotate with questioning the author. In primary grade levels, when I'm working with teachers, some of my primary teacher friends like to add a physical chair. That's the author's chair within their classroom. And then that really creates a physical space to question the author. Because students can, whenever they're reading, they remember to leave space for the author. I went to Catholic school for many years, and so you may remember hearing leave room for the Holy Spirit, right? Leave room for the author in any discussion that you're having about a text. Students early and often need to be very aware that there is that presence of the author in everything they're reading. And so using a strategy like this helps them remember that that's always the case. The author always made decisions intentionally that ultimately affect you as the reader. Questions on that? Comments? All right. Another piece that's highlighted in the resource at the bottom is creative annotations. We saw this a little bit with the image we were looking at earlier where the student drew on the text and you could see some illustrations. So here we can think about two parts. One is that we're absolutely welcoming of illustrated annotations for students with that same caveat that we have in mind that they need to remember then what that means. So if students are having trouble remembering from a picture, then we'll want to keep them more towards a word-based annotation. B here for collaborative annotations is now where students would share with one another. A great way to implement this is thinking about making this a very quick activity at the beginning of class, maybe even part of a warm-up, where students are given a short piece of text and a purpose for annotating, and they need to move through it and annotate, and then they share. with one other person. They have discussion on what they annotated. By putting annotations next to each other, it helps students understand, again, that learning is a process and it's a different process for everyone. One piece of text and the same purpose, you might come up with different ideas. And that's okay as long as you're using the text and your understanding to guide you. Any questions or comments on creative annotations? If you're looking at the slide deck, you'll notice that every single slide underneath has additional information. So if something looks really interesting to you, go ahead and read more about it in the speaker notes below. We were going to, if there was a large number of us, be in a pair deck for this, but let's just look at this together and participate in the chat or aloud. So looking at this prompt, I'm going to read you a prompt and I'm going to ask you to think about, if this is my end goal, the prompt that I have in mind at the end of reading, what direction might you give to your students so that they, as they read, they annotate towards this purpose? Here's the prompt. Authors choose words and language carefully to communicate a message. Write an essay analyzing how Sandra Cisneros uses imagery to reveal a theme. Use evidence from the text to support your response. So here in this passage, we're asking the students to look at word choice and a message or a theme. So how might you direct your students to annotate while they're reading? Any thoughts? Something came in the chat, imagery using senses. So you could ask students to underline examples of imagery. Love it. If you're not using the language of imagery, you could make that language that's more familiar to them. So if you're working with maybe our English language learners or special education students, you could make that connection to imagery and sensory language. And maybe you're going to have them underline things that help them with the 5 senses. But if my grade level standard is calling it imagery, I have to make that connection for them. Anything else? What else could I tell my students to look for? The second part of this is theme, right? So big ideas or a lesson learned, right? You could have students look for those things as they read, and they're going to be then marking along the way what they see. A word of caution is I wouldn't have your students read for both of those things at one time. Close reading involves multiple reads of the same text. And so I might, in this example, give the first time that they're looking for imagery and they're underlining where they see imagery or sensory language. And then the second time through, now maybe they're circling like some different notation or a different colored highlighter. Now they are going to circle big ideas or lessons learned. And so after 2 reads now, I have a great robust set of annotations that help me see the connection between the language that was used and the big ideas. So the places where literally the marks are on the paper at the same spot, those are the juiciest pieces of text evidence that I'm going to use in my discussion when I'm getting to analyze the text. So we have in the chat that they could look for the theme the first time and the second to look for imagery. You can certainly try that. I find that theme is a little bit harder to do the very first time you've read something. And so if you're going to have students read multiple times, I tend to keep those, let's say, bigger ones for the second time around. Imagery is pretty concrete. They can do it line by line by line. whereas theme requires them looking at the text in larger chunks. And so you can try it both ways. There's not really a wrong, but you might find that students have more success when they do the more concrete, easier to attain piece the first time, and the second time, kind of the larger piece of thinking. Thanks for sharing. All right, so let's look at this example. Using the text, yep, theme is definitely difficult for 4th grade, for sure. It's difficult in every grade, let's be honest. Why? Because every year the level of text complexity increases. So if theme is easy for you in 8th grade, then maybe you're not reading 8th grade complex texts, because it should be difficult. But 4th grade for sure is a tough time. The example that we looked at, the prompt, is being applied to this excerpt from House on Mango Street, 4 skinny trees. And so let's look at the marks that were made. The marks that were made here were made by someone that was given the purpose that we identified, looking at imagery and then looking at how imagery leads to a big idea. You can see that the circles, right, and the underline really pull out our images. And then on the side, you can see that there's another layer of thinking that's really happening. When something repeats, we're thinking about, why was it repeated so often? Maybe that's a big idea. When that happens again, we start to think through that. We even can think about what those words are conveying as far as emotions. Maybe we want to use the language of tone and thinking about that as well. So in this example, I think the student does achieve the purpose for reading, but that's because the teacher was very explicit about it ahead of time. If I would have given this excerpt and told students to make marks, you can see where student A has a very different paper than student B, and student C can't understand why theirs looks even different. So it's up to us as the educators to be very clear about what we want students to pull out of a particular passage. This is something that I talk about often with the teachers that I coach and mentor, because sometimes our instructional materials that we're given have a very wide berth of things that they want us to talk about. If I look at my teacher's guide, it wants me to talk about language and theme and characters and point of view all within one story. Here is where my planning, my knowledge of my curriculum, and my understanding of my daily objectives helps me laser focus that for students. And when I tell them we're just going to be talking about imagery today, then they're able to better attack a text that's more complex. If they feel that they need to be finding every Easter egg in every section, they're going to feel more overwhelmed. So the more that I can focus this for my students, the better off our annotation activity will be. Let's talk a little bit about how this looks digitally, right? So digital annotations, we saw, if you were with me in the last session on evidence-based strategies for literacy, Des Arnold, the presenter, talked about it a little bit. But there are lots of ways that we can do this in our current context. And so one is through digital annotations. So let's talk about the tools that you have available to you, what you have been using, and what you might be interested in using moving forward. So does anyone want to share how right now, when you've been distance learning with your students, how are you having students interact with the texts? Does anyone want to share? Feel free to unmute. So the first piece that I'd like you to think about is what is the digital content that's available to them? Because, for example, if I'm teaching from a textbook, if I'm using the Journeys series, there is a portal for Journeys online that my district or school may have purchased that may allow for annotation really easily. And perhaps when we were in brick and mortar settings, I didn't use that with students, but now in our current situation, there is an increased onus and reasoning why I might use that with my students. Thank you. We have someone shared highlighting and discussing, marking with sticky notes, with written notes. Are you still having students do that? I don't know. Erin, what grade level are you working with?
I'm working with 4th grade.
Okay. And so since they've been distance learning?
Well, no, not, I was thinking in a regular classroom setting.
Yep, absolutely. And that's so helpful to start with because we need to think about how are we converting this, right? So if in the classroom I was using highlighting, sticky notes, and marginal notes, how am I kind of making this work in the blended learning environment, right?
Yes.
So you're like, yes, that's the jackpot question, Laura, right? So let's kind of talk through some options that you might have. One is you might have digital content that allows for this. So I use the example of Journeys to say that your district may have purchased some online access to the textbooks that you have that you would be able to, if using a text from there, you would be able to have students log in and annotate as they read. Does anyone know if they have that option available to them?
I know for my school, we were previously using an older series and we've purchased a new series for next year. So it would, I'm guessing, maybe have some of those features, but I'm not really sure.
So that's worth asking the question. Ask the question, how can students interact with these texts through the online portal? Okay. Absolutely, great. Another thing is if you're the one selecting the content for your students, right, then you can provide them the content. So some of the applications that became free in the time of the school closures for at least a limited time are things like Newsella and even Actively Learn. And they have resources in which students can be assigned a text to read and annotate. Now, in a pre-COVID world, those were paid subscriptions. So some of them, it's worth finding out, you know, what is still going to be free, what has my district purchased that we can use. So some of these content subscriptions also allow for student annotation as well. So I think I'm going to take the time right now and let's go out and let's look at one of these. All right, is anyone using Newsella currently? Or we can use whatever resource you use if you're pulling content, not from a series. What I do like about Newsella is does have a single sign-on with Google. So if your students or you are already using Google or G Suite, then you're able to do that. Let's look at John Lewis. So it looks like there is an article here. If you're not familiar with the site, up here are different Lexile levels. For close reading, we really want to encourage students to be looking at the same grade level text. And then what we would do is we would provide scaffolds up so that that student could be successful. So we see things like read aloud, hide, add to text set. So those are different pieces that students see, but then also I'm seeing that as being a teacher in this site. If I pull out here, you can see that there is option for a quiz and then option for a writing activity as well that I can assign. But as we move through here, see this annotation tool pops up as soon as I select something. So I could save it, or I could even add a layer of annotation, right? And so I can say, this is about John Lewis's relevance to our current context. Save. Maybe my teacher will assign for me different colors, different things to highlight. Here, history of civil rights injustices, right? And so here now I have a version of this text that everyone is reading that I, as the teacher, could assign what I'd like everyone to annotate for, or they could kind of pick on their own, and then we use it as discussion to say, what did you annotate for the big idea as you were reading? That's one example. Are there other sites that you like to use? Newsella, before I take you out of here, also has a very large category of things to read, right? You can either search by topic, or you can filter by different grade level or skill as well. Actively Learn currently has the same. Now this one looks like it's free through July 31st. So again, just be careful what you're going to do. But if I sign in here, why I like Actively Learn is that, yes, it has content just as Newsella does, which is nice for all content areas. But then it also allows me to upload my own texts. So the annotation tools that exist within here can be put right onto a PDF that I upload to them as well. So here I can look at the curriculum units. Maybe I want to pick 9th grade ELA, and maybe I want to look at motivation for perseverance. We have Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. So what Actively Learn does is it was built to annotate. So you can insert questions such as polls, as well as directions on what to do along the way for students. So this is really making a close reading experience, not in the classroom when I'm necessarily next to the student, but in that more asynchronous fashion. So I have done nothing with this ahead of time. All I did was create an account and then logged in, and this was already in the library. And we can see where I could choose to keep this in here, or I could edit it as well. Another one that was brought up is ReadWorks. So let's go ahead and go to readworks.org. So here we can find reading passages as well that can be filtered for all of these pieces. And we can also, let's go grade, let's see, I know I have a 4th grade teacher here. Let's do that, right? So if I want to think about this and I'm looking at the world history piece, I can again assign this text to students. Log in, and now I can see this entire piece here. I can assign it to my students, and if I have the classes set up, I could import it into Google Classroom. And again, I might choose to have them think through how they would annotate as they read. We also have resources available like vocabulary words, as well as question sets that we can assign as well. So back to where we started, digital annotation might be an option that's embedded right within the digital content that you're already using with your students. So perhaps one option is maybe I'm just underutilizing what's already available in the texts that I'm having students read. For an example, I, as a functioning adult, as a professional, use Google Comments all the time, because that's where I keep my thinking about what it is I'm reading. Here's where I'm using that metacognitive process. With students, I didn't use Google Comments as much as I should have. So I could have them read a piece in Google Slides, in Google Docs, in Google Sheets. I could have them read a word problem. I could have them read a paragraph and then add a comment for it as well on their annotations or what they're thinking about. So think about first, what tools do I already have that maybe I'm underutilizing when it comes to annotating text? The second section I have here is about when you're using your own text or other media. So Actively Learn, we just went there. I can upload into Actively Learn any text that I would like students to work with. So let's say that I'm not here now for this text, but instead I want to go home and I want to go to my workspace and I want to upload something. So here is where I can even take something. So for example, I wrote a course and I pulled down this article and I changed it. I took out the pieces that I needed and I added in these questions. So now I can provide the text instead of the website doing it for me, and I can customize this for my students as well. That's a great way to use the annotation tool on text that's still provided by you, the teacher. Kami is a great annotation tool for PDFs if you are using Google with your students. So let's go over to our folder for today, Annotating Text for Close Reading. And let's say I'm going to pull up this PDF, the one about purposeful annotations that's in your folder. And let's say I want students to be able to interact with this PDF. What I can do is I can add Kami for free as one of the connected applications right into Google Drive. How do I do this? Open up a PDF. You can open up this same PDF that I'm looking at in your Google Drive. When you click on the option to open with, you'll notice that it has the Connect More Apps option. If I go here, then I can search for Kami, PDF and document annotation. And mine says installed because it's already installed. Yours, you can install it if it's not already there. So what does Kami allow me to do? For free. So what Kami allows a student or you as the educator to do is to go in and annotate anything on the PDF that they're currently looking at. Notice that I can give a color on the left. It's going to make me reload my page. You can see where some of this information was already being used. I could make this highlighting a color. Oops. And then I could even add that second layer of thinking about it in the metacognition and say, these are reasons to annotate, right? And what Google Drive and Kami will do is it will save a version of this for me in my drive personally that's annotated. You'll notice some of the pieces are locked because I have not paid for premium content, but I use the free version of Kami with my 100+ students to help them annotate anytime there was a PDF. And so they were able digitally on their Chromebooks to figure out, how do I capture my thoughts right next to what it is that I'm reading? Questions on annotating PDFs with Kami? There are other options out there, but it's the one that I've used for many years. The last one I want to have you think about is if you're using Zoom or Google Meets with your students, then there's an option for you to annotate with them. Similarly, like I did earlier, I use the Annotate button to create things like stamps, as well as drawing tool where I can circle pieces. I can also select anything on the page. And so by using these different tools, and then I can erase them, I'm teaching students that everyone annotates when they're thinking about the learning process. And the learning process doesn't just have to be paper and pencil or a book. It can be anything that's in front of us, and that all media gets annotated, right? That's what we do when we're watching something together, like the Netflix viewing parties or watch parties that have been popping up. I don't know about you guys, but I was just as interested in watching the release of Hamilton on Disney Plus as I was in staying engaged in the Twitter chat that was happening at the same time. Basically what that was is a big annotation of the text. We're watching the text over here and we're having a conversation about it on the right-hand side or through a Twitter app. And so it's really this is really the best time to be making students aware that there's always discourse happening around the text itself, and that they're part of it by annotating. Questions or comments on using annotations with other media? Okay. Our last piece here is Edpuzzle. If you are using Edpuzzle for videos, or you're using videos in general, then I'd like to introduce you to Edpuzzle. Here's where you can add in, I'm gonna again authenticate with Google again. Sorry for my multiple personalities here. And what you can do is you can stop a video at any time and you can ask questions. So for example, here I put in a video, and at any point in the video, I can insert a question, a comment. And so when students are viewing that same video, then they have something they have to interact with at that time. So it's really a game changer when I'm working with different media. We're about out of time, so I want to move over to our last piece, how to use annotations, right? Usually the annotations aren't the end-all be-all themselves. As I mentioned earlier, they're part of the early stage of close reading. So what do I do with those annotations? One, we mentioned earlier, the collaborative piece. We have students share with one another, right? They either can compare to find what they have to demonstrate how well they've comprehended the passage. I'm using it, one, for evidence of myself, of their learning. Two, I could illustrate author's craft. The house example comes to us from my reading apprenticeship days. But in the house activity, you have students read one passage for two different purposes and then compare what they've annotated. And that's going to give that light bulb of the aha, that the purpose for reading is so important to know ahead of time. As came up earlier, we can use annotations for evidence in classroom discussion or even in read to write activities, such as a text-dependent analysis later on. What I would really behoove you to do is take the time to have classroom discussions with your students, more now than ever before you would give them a writing assessment. Have them be comfortable in a low-risk fashion of sharing what they annotated before it becomes part of a larger graded assignment. Again, my questions for myself for best practices: what is the purpose of reading the text? How can students capture their thoughts while reading in a meaningful way? What tools are available, and how will the annotation be used further? If I think about that with every text, it's going to help guide my classroom activities with my students. So we're about out of time. If you liked what you saw here, feel free to mark your calendar. We're going to be having an event on Friday, October 9th. If you're not available, we're also going to give asynchronous access to the entire day. But it'll be a half-day morning virtual symposium on text-dependent analysis related pieces. And then our evaluation. At the end of today, you're going to be asked, did this session meet your expectations? How will you share or use it? And what key information did you come away with? So feel free to take notes. You have my contact information. I would love to hear from you, any questions that you have. If you want to click down into day 1, it will take you back on slide 30 to our matrix for today. Have a wonderful rest of the day. The next session begins promptly after our PM keynote, who is moving from 12:15 to 1:15. So I hope to see all of you again. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.